Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Stephen Vladeck, law professor at Georgetown University. Professor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Brittany.
I would love to get your legal perspective to President Trump's response to what we've seen come out of Los Angeles over the past couple of days. So, starting on Friday, we've seen protests in LA over workplace ICE raids. Reports on the ground indicate that these protests were largely peaceful, with pockets of violence, chaos, and vandalism. In a historic moment over the weekend and against California Governor Gavin Newsom's wishes, President Trump deployed 2,000 members of the National Guard to LA. And days later, the Trump administration then deployed hundreds of active duty Marines to the city, as well as an additional 2,000 National Guard troops. And this is the first time a president deployed the National Guard without a governor asking in 60 years, and it certainly bucks the status quo. So first, legally, is the president allowed to do this?
So the short answer is it actually depends. And it depends on whether we, and Brittany, more importantly, the courts, are persuaded that the factual predicates for using military force domestically are present. The statute the president's relying upon requires there to be some kind of situation, a rebellion, an insurrection, or some other combination that has made it impossible for local authorities and state authorities to enforce civilian laws. Brittany, I think there's a really good argument that that's not what we have here, but that's really what the legality largely turns on.
I mean, that's really interesting because California officials said, President Trump, we don't need the National Guard. We actually are handling this on our own. And the president did it anyway. So if the court is looking at that, I mean, how do they square that circle?
So historically, the president has usually won that debate. And, you mentioned not in 60 years have we seen this kind of use of the National Guard. The last time that it happened was over the objections of Governor Wallace in Alabama, when it was President Lyndon Baines Johnson, using the Alabama National Guard to protect the Selma marchers. So we have examples of presidents overriding governors that I suspect most of us would think were legitimate, were a context in which, the president was in the right. I think what's complicating the situation in Los Angeles is that I think there's a widespread view that the president really doesn't have the better of the argument here, and that we should be especially wary about using the military except and unless it's absolutely necessary.
So he federalized the National Guard. Him and his administration sent in additional Marine troops. I mean, under the reasoning behind why President Trump deployed them in the first place, what can and cannot they do?
So at least based on the authorities that the president has invoked to this point, the only thing that these troops can be used to do is to borrow from the relevant legal opinion, protect federal functions. What that means is they can't go out on their own to enforce our immigration laws. They can't go out on their own to detain and arrest individuals. But where we get to a very gray line very quickly is if you are using federalized National Guard troops, or if you're using the Marines to accompany ICE officers on immigration raids, or to protect ICE officers during immigration protests, then I think you're putting them in a position where they might need to detain people, where they might need to arrest people. And that's where we run into a different statute called the Posse Comitatus Act, which bars using the military for what we would think of as ordinary law enforcement without Congress's specific permission. The statute President Trump invoked on Saturday doesn't count. And so we have this legal line that the military is going to have to try to observe between protecting federal functions on one hand and ordinary law enforcement, which is prohibited on the other.
So, based on the way President Trump deployed them, they have, as you say, this certain line that they cannot cross unless Congress gets involved. Is there any indication Congress will get involved at this point, do you think?
So I don't imagine Congress is going to pass any new statutes anytime soon. The trickier part is there is a very old statute, known somewhat unhelpfully as Insurrection Act, which actually gives the president even broader power to use the military, including for civilian law enforcement. It's interesting that as we sit here, President Trump has not invoked that statute yet. But it's possible that if things continue to escalate, or at the very least, if President Trump claims that things are continuing to escalate in Los Angeles, that is the next step, and that we will see an effort by President Trump to invoke that statute, at which point he could try to use the National Guard, try to use the Marines to enforce federal laws directly.
And insurrection is a word we've heard since January 6th, 2021. I mean, legally speaking, what technically is an insurrection when it comes to this case? And I mean, how much leeway will that give President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think, whatever the definition of insurrection is, and I'm one who thinks that it requires some kind of armed attempt to overthrow the government by force, right? This isn't it. I mean, this is, protests, maybe at the most extreme, this is protests that have turned to at least a modicum of violence. But, we have a long history of both peaceful and, more hostile protests in American history that we have not treated as insurrections, and for good reason. There's something different about protesting the government and trying to overthrow it. That won't stop President Trump, I think, from invoking the Insurrection Act. We've already seen him point, for example, to what's happening along the U.S.-Mexico border as an invasion, in context in which historically we wouldn't have thought it was an invasion. I think the trickier question, Brittany, is if President Trump takes that step, will we see federal courts second-guessing a determination by the president that what's happening in Los Angeles, or perhaps in other cities, rises to the relevant factual predicate of an insurrection?
You wrote a really great Substack article a few days ago on exactly what we're talking about. And that is what led me to contact you to have this conversation. And in that article, you listed out 3 reasons why you're still pretty unnerved about President Trump federalizing the National Guard. It sounds like you kind of think this could be a slippery slope. So can you talk to us about those concerns?
Sure. I mean, I think they really sort of fall into 2 loose categories. The first is, as you say, Brittany, the slippery slope, the possibility that what President Trump is doing is just the first step down a path that ends with a, much broader invocation of this old statute, the Insurrection Act, to use the military to enforce federal laws on a nationwide basis. And we have a rich tradition. We have a time-honored tradition in this country of keeping the military out of everyday law enforcement, for good reasons. I mean, one is, I think we have long understood that the rule of law depends upon the military being subservient to civilian authority and not the other way around. And 2, and this is the other part of the conversation, it's not a mission the military is trained for. And so wholly apart from what to me would be the corrosive effects of turning the military against, even a segment of the American population, you also have the problem that this is not why we have a military. We don't have a military to enforce immigration laws in Los Angeles or Chicago or New York. We have a military to protect us from foreign invaders. And, whatever rhetorical force the president and his allies might get from portraying immigrants as foreign invaders, that's not what the founders understood. So, my concern is that even if this is not the extreme case, there are lots of respects in which this could be a dangerous precedent for further and future and more widespread uses of the military domestically that may or may not, Brittany, have plausible legal arguments behind them, but that I think would be deeply problematic from the perspective of how we've historically divided civilian and military authority in the United States.
And ever since this weekend, ever since President Trump deployed the National Guard, we saw a legal showdown brewing between California Governor Newsom as well as President Trump. Newsom announced he's suing the Trump administration over their deployment of the Marines and the National Guard. How strong do you think Newsom's case is?
It's interesting. It's novel in that much of what Governor Newsom is complaining about is procedural, Brittany, not substantive, meaning that the president didn't go through him in federalizing the California National Guard, and he had to. Governor Newsom's also arguing that he had the right to veto the calling up of the National Guard. That I think is its own tricky legal argument. the messier question, whether it comes up in the Newsom case or whether it comes up downstream, is going to be whether courts are going to be willing to second guess the president's assertion that the facts on the ground warrant the deployment of troops. Historically, they have not been. Historically, courts have been very deferential to presidents of both parties when they've invoked national security considerations in the context of statutes like the Insurrection Act. I think one of the really, academically interesting and real-world problematic questions that we see over and over again with the Trump administration is whether that deference, that what lawyers call presumption of regularity, is going to in any way be undermined by the relatively casual relationship that the president seems to have with the facts on the ground.
And it seems like that this is a case where it really opens a Pandora's box. And Governor Newsom said that what we're witnessing is not law enforcement, it's authoritarianism, and democracy is under assault before our very eyes. So as a law professor, what do you make of that characterization?
So, I think Governor Newsom is right in one critical respect, which is if left unchecked, this kind of use of military power doesn't have an obvious stopping point. And so, we should be wary, not that this is the, sort of the crisis, but that this is an important escalation. This is an important step that ought to be dealt with very carefully, that we ought to, get sort of all, how do I say, all the legal arguments out and onto the table now, because at some point, if the president keeps pushing these arguments and isn't rebuffed, then I think Governor Newsom's concerns could very well come to pass.
And so as a law professor, what do you think, what we're seeing in LA, what does that indicate to you about maybe broader conversations about rule of law in this country, about presidential power in this country? And are you looking for any signposts of anything to come? Because as you said, you're looking at these steps here and you're saying, hey, this is an important step now that we need to take care of. I think part of what's tricky here, Brittany, is that historically, one of the most effective limits on the domestic use of the military has been political pushback. So President George W. Bush famously did not call out the military to help restore order in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina because he was worried about the political costs. We live in an age where, for better or for worse, there are almost no political costs, at least within his party, to anything President Trump does. And so what that means is it ratchets up the pressures on courts, who really become the last institution standing. And it seems to me that, the courts, I think, can check the president in some of these cases, have already checked the president in some of these cases. But at the end of the day, the courts can't do it alone. And so, part of why what's happening in Los Angeles is, I think, so important is not just because these are test cases for the federal courts, but these are really test cases for our political culture. If the political leadership in Washington, in both chambers of Congress, is going to stand idly by while the president sends troops into our cities under, at best dubious claims of insurrection, I think that's just as dangerous a precedent, Brittany, as the court saying that this is somehow within the president's legal authority. To that point, even LA Mayor Karen Bass said that this was a test case. You're saying that what's happening in LA will have the ripple effects of things to come. Do you think anything really is missing from the national conversation and this conversation between you and I when it comes to what we're seeing coming out of Los Angeles?
I think, we're so inclined these days to view everything in partisan terms, that you're either on one side of the partisan spectrum or you're on the other. And it seems to me that, there ought to be a few principles that cut through that and that cut across that divide. We've seen that already in the context of the Alien Enemies Act cases, with a remarkable amount of bipartisan support for basic understandings of due process, and of the idea that, folks shouldn't be removed to foreign prisons without at least a modicum of an opportunity to defend themselves. I hope that maybe this can be the next example of that, domestic use of the military is such an important but also grave authority that it's not something that we should get into the habit of turning into another weapon in the partisan political wars. That it really ought to be reserved for circumstances in which there are compelling nonpartisan or bipartisan reasons for doing it. Because if we get to a place where we accept using the military simply as a tool for exercising partisan political power, for achieving your partisan political agenda, then that's going to, I think, dramatically undermine public trust in the military as an institution. And it's going to ratchet up the very real concern that the military will become an abusive means of enforcing laws on the ground, as opposed to what has historically been the case, where they really have been the law enforcers of last resort.
Professor, I really appreciate your expertise and your insight today. And you are welcome back anytime to break down other legal questions that I have. I hope you come back on for many more conversations. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Brittany. I really enjoyed the conversation.